Hey, everybody, this is Eric Mishi, SAVE Executive Director, Suicide Awareness, Voices of Education. Glad you guys could join us today. We are continuing our conversations this week during Suicide Prevention Awareness Week, having conversations with folks who are involved in working to prevent suicide, support suicide loss survivors, with folks who are leaders of organizations on a local, state, and national level. Great conversations with a lot of folks. We had an earlier conversation with Verna Mickelson, who is with the Minnesota Department of Health, suicide, the 988 Lifeline, and the work that she's doing in that space. We had a chat with SAVE board member, Dr. Leslie Price, who's also a licensed clinical psychologist that works with kids and with parents, and talked about the challenges of a world in which loneliness and helplessness and kind of isolation are creating challenges for kids today in ways that most of us who are a little older probably don't recall. So I'm excited to have this conversation with folks who are not only good friends of SAVE, but also folks that have been very directly impacted by suicide. Bob and Lynn Poferl. How are you guys doing?
Great.
We're good, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us today. You know, I got a chance to meet. Bob was one of the first people I met not long after I became executive director a little over a year ago, and shared with me his journey and kind of his backstory and the work that he's done, obviously, in the nonprofit world. Bob, you were remind me again what space that you were in the world of.
So after a long corporate career, I worked with Greater Twin Cities United Way here in the Twin Cities.
That's right. So I spent most of my career in government politics and then got involved in nonprofit world as kind of a way to do my penance. So you and I kind of both ended up in a little different way, but the corporate world to the nonprofit world. So let's start with maybe kind of share with us a little bit about kind of your backstory and how you got involved with SAVE and how you got involved with this issue of suicide at all.
So Lynn and I we raised a blended family, 5 kids, and unfortunately we lost 2 of our kids. We lost our daughter to Katie to bone cancer, and that was 17 years ago. And then we lost our son, Tim, to suicide about 10 years ago. So, obviously we've been through a lot as a family. It impacted us, certainly personally and all of our family in different ways. And throughout this, kind of period of time, we just, we were kind of grasping for ways to kind of cope with our own grief and really try to channel our grief into something positive. And it was really hard to do, but we've found a couple of ways to really make things better for us on a day-to-day basis and to really honor Tim's memory.
So before we get to that conversation about Tim, let's talk a little bit about with the work that you do with your daughter, because that's with cancer, right? And it's working there. So share a little bit about the work that you've been doing in that space, because I think that's important too, because I think it kind of lends itself to that journey and that place, even as it relates to Tim. So let's share with that.
Sure. So when Katie passed away, I had owned a dating service. And the woman who bought the dating service from me after Katie had passed, she said, we've got to do something. We've got to do something to honor Katie's memory. And so we came up with a bachelorette date auction. We called the event Date for Life. And the first couple of years, our kids volunteered at the event. That's what you do with your kids, right? You put them to work. And John, our oldest, had said, this feels good, right? It feels good to give back. It feels good to, again, do something positive in such a terrible situation. So he started an event. At that point, it was a softball tournament called Love, Beer, Hate, Cancer. So that event, we actually just hosted our 15th annual Love Beer Hate Cancer just on Saturday. And it has evolved into a kickball tournament. But from the beginning, since Katie passed, like that has, these events are how we have channeled our energies. And I think one of the best parts about these events is that we get to go and talk about our kids. It gives me a reason to tell Katie's story and to help remember her for who she was.
Yeah, prior to my role here as executive director of SAVE, I spent 11 years as the executive director of an organization called Spear Key, where we worked closely with families who were impacted by critical injuries, serious illnesses, and things like that. And time again, that idea and that notion of wanting to do something meaningful and impactful to continue that memory and kind of the essence of who that individual is and was, after they're gone, incredibly important. And so, as you think about that with Katie, what has been most important part of that process for you as you've continued each year to make sure that you keep Katie's memory alive and keep her connected with your family and friends and those who knew her?
So Katie always liked the spotlight. So I think, she's looking down on us every time we are able to tell her story or talk about her, and she's smiling. But I think in general, in addition to being able to tell her story and talk about her, being part of the solution for helping other families has really been a big factor in this. We've got big goals for how much money we want to raise for the organizations that we support. And, from a cancer standpoint, we've raised, almost $875,000 for pediatric cancer research. So we're really proud of those efforts. And again, it helps us heal knowing that we're helping other families.
Yeah.
I'll also say that, our story could be anyone's story. And, we didn't have financial needs or anything like that when we were going through it, but we know a lot of people that just have been less fortunate, and it becomes just such a devastating life changer. But when we can go out and share our story, it inspires people to get involved, and it can move the needle from a fundraising standpoint, whether it's cancer research, suicide prevention. That's a part of our story too, is that it just, we know people can relate to stories, can envision themselves going through this, and they kind of respect how we're able to go out and share.
Yeah.
We've met people who struggle with that grief and have trouble getting out of that cycle of grief because they don't have something to channel that energy to. So again, we hope that we're inspiring people to take action, even in a small way, can make a big difference.
Yeah, this issue of grief, right, and how we process that, how we grieve. There used to be a lot of emphasis on, that there was various stages of grief, right? So it was all very clinical, right? There was this stage and that stage. And I think we now know that there is no particular stage, right? Everybody grieves differently. Everybody has to process that grief differently, in terms of how do they come to terms with it. And I think for some folks, they take that as you all have, and you've taken that grief, and we talk about kind of converting that to hope, if you will, right? Giving other people the opportunity to talk about these things, to have these conversations. And so even as we talk about Tim, and we talk about how Run with the Herd came about, I think it's important for people to understand Katie's story and the work that you've done in that space, because both of these examples of taking grief and trying to turn that grief into hope and to give hope to other people. So let's talk a little bit about Tim. So let's talk about how, before we get to run with the herd, how to run with the herd. Why is that even a thing?
So, Tim was 26 years old. He was, college graduate, had a good job. He was living up in Becker, Minnesota. So he wasn't part of our kind of day-to-day, family life. But we certainly stayed in touch with him and, enjoyed being with him. But we didn't fully appreciate or even know what he was going through from just a depression standpoint. And he really never was one to ask for any help. He wouldn't share a lot of what he was going through. He always put a really happy face on pretty much every aspect of his life. So we really didn't have a reason to be concerned. And then suddenly I got a text message from him saying goodbye, and it was over. And I just, we talked about Katie's story, and, obviously losing kids is just absolutely devastating. In Katie's case, we had a little bit of a time to prepare because hers was a 5-year battle, right? The suddenness of losing Tim and just the intensity of that shock was really hard to grapple with.
Yeah, and that's what makes suicide loss obviously so much more complex. I just had a conversation last week with MJ Weiss, who I think you all know because of the work we've been doing with her and her family on suicide prevention barriers at a public structure here in the Twin Cities. But, when I was the executive director of Spare Key and worked with families who lost kids to cancer, lost kids to an accident, and things like that, that grief was overwhelming. But there was at least some sense of that, this was something that was out of everybody's control, and these it didn't make it any easier. But for whatever reason, the complex grief of suicide is that much more significant. It's that, as you mentioned, Bob, it's that kind of immediacy. It's that not being prepared for that void that gets created so quickly, and then all the other complexities, right? The guilt that comes with that, the anger, again, those various stages of grief and trying to contemplate that. So as you process Tim's loss, kind of in the aftermath of that, I mean, how did you and your family process that? How did you grieve, and as a family that had already lost a child, how do you process that as a way that you can look at this and say, that there are better days ahead?
Well, I think the initial loss is pretty devastating, and it takes quite a while to work through the real emotions, as you said, the guilt that goes along with that. Like, what could I have done? What did I say? How could, as a parent, how could I have failed my child like this? So I sought counseling, and that really helped me kind of put some perspective on things, gave me some tools to just, kind of work things out in my own mind. And we as a family, I think these losses land differently on each of us. If you're a sibling, or if you're a step sibling, or a biological parent versus a step parent, they landed on us differently. But I think mostly through these events, we found a way to kind of rally as a family in a way that I don't see very often. A lot of times these kind of losses can tear families apart.
Mm-hmm.
I think it did just the opposite for us. I think it really kind of pulled us together. and gave us this kind of rallying point to try to do something positive out of these horrible situations.
Well, because we had been doing events for Katie, it was just a natural extension. It didn't take us long to say, okay, what are we going to do for Tim? Like, you know, this is what we do.
Yeah, our son Justin came up with that idea right away. He and his wife said, "Hey, we have to do a run."
Yeah.
So
you mentioned, Bob, the therapy and the counseling. For most men, saying that you're going to go to counseling, get help, and talk to somebody about this is not an easy thing to do, right? And as we talk about suicide prevention, generally speaking, that idea of being willing to go talk about it and have conversations with people is incredibly important, and is incredibly important to the healing process as well, isn't it?
Well, it sure was for me. And I only saw a counselor just a few times, but it did, it kind of reinforced the fact that it did help to talk. And it did, I was not imagining the emotions I was going through. They were real, and they got validated. And then, I could see the healing power of just talking, which really kind of fueled, all right, then what are we going to do about this more public facing, right? If we're going through this and we have trouble talking about it, what about all the other people that have suffered a loss, right? So, when we started Run with the Herd, it was really to kind of create that place for people to come together and really create a safe space to talk and to share their stories.
I think initially it was to bring the people together that had touched Tim's life, for us to heal as a team. And it evolved into, okay, if this is helping us, how can we help others?
Yeah. Well,
there was an element of role modeling for our kids that I think was important to us as parents. Is, we always raised our kids to kind of believe that it's really not what happens to you that matters, it's what you do about it. And we've lived it now, and we've had to kind of step up and live by our own words to set that example. And I think that was really important to us too.
Yeah. That your willingness to have these conversations publicly, right? To talk about Tim, to talk about suicide, is a critical part of the work that we're trying to do, which is, again, to eliminate that stigma that's attached to suicide, and to make sure that other families who are suicide loss survivors know that, while suicide itself may not be normal, not talking about it isn't normal either. I mean, we talk about people who die from cancer. We talk about people who die from accidents. We need to be talking about people who die by suicide, so that it doesn't hide there in the dark recesses of shame. And instead, these are conversations that we have openly with one another, so that is a part of not only remembering that individual who's died by suicide, but it's also that process of recovery and handling that grief. And so from that, Run with the Herd started. So talk about Run with the Herd. And you mentioned your kids came up and said, we got to do a run. How did the name come about? What is it? What's the goals and objectives of it?
So Tim, in his adult life, really became a runner. He was never a kid that was, super active. And then, he got a job and he starts being a productive member of society, and he takes up running. And he started to really, sign up for a lot of 5Ks, and as a way to get in shape. And he just really enjoyed it. So, but he also had a group of friends that, college friends, that would sit around at night and just kind of, try to, what animal represents who we are, and they each had a favorite animal, and Tim's was the bison, and he viewed himself as kind of this leader of a herd, this herd animal that kind of looks out for his the people in his circle, right? So that's how Run with the Herd became kind of the tagline. And of course, when you see all the visuals that we use with Run with the Herd, and that bison's pretty prominent in most of our materials. And that's the reason.
So this year was the 10th year, right?
Right.
And so talk about that first year when this came together. What was that like, pulling this together and trying to make that happen? So these things don't just happen, right? You got it right. There's nothing that just happens. So talk about that first year.
So, first of all, Bob and I are not runners, so we really didn't know what we were getting into with this. And luckily, our son Justin and his wife Jenny are runners and had done races, so we really leaned on them from the structural standpoint. But the one thing we knew is we wanted to keep it light and make it fun.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in addition to the run itself, we serve pizza and beer afterwards. Let's take this time to honor and celebrate the lives that, we've lost. And Bob didn't mention this, but when Tim was in college, he lived in a house with all the track guys. So he was surrounded by runners, even though at that point he wasn't a runner. And I think that's what inspired him later was, this group of friends. So it was easy to tap into that community through Tim's roommates. And then, it's our friends, it's our family, it's Tim's friends, it's, extended family. And I think that first year we had I want to say it was close to 300 people.
I think so.
At our very first run. So it was therapeutic. It really helped everybody to deal with what they were processing.
And 10 years later, as you think about this event, not so much how many people show up and things like that, but as you think about this 10 years later, you've raised a lot of money for SAVE, and so that those funds have been extraordinarily important to this organization to allow us to do the work that we do. But as you think about the past 10 years, what are the 2 or 3 things that you think are the most important part of Run with the Herd beyond the money? Because obviously the money is, again, I'll always take money. It's great. But it's got to be beyond just the money. So what are the 2 or 3 things that have meant the most to you over these past 10 years of doing Run with the Herd?
So when we started the event, as Lynn said, this was a way to honor Tim's memory. We were remembering one. And over the years, we've grown by getting to know other families that have suffered a loss. People would come to us or make us aware of it. And now we have 21 families that have suffered a loss that are kind of part of our community, our Run with the Herd community. We've got a memorial garden that we've created that with signs that kind of memorialize all the people that we've lost that we're aware of. So that's been a big part of it, just creating that sense of community and that safe space to just talk about their loved one and talk about suicide and just kind of share stories. That's been probably the biggest thing. But also, we get to talk about Tim every single year. And by sharing his story, it keeps his memory alive. It shows us that there was purpose behind some greater plan to what is going on here. This particular loss, devastating, but it was, it impacted things in a positive way. We had to make sure of that, right?
And I want to add one more factor to that. Thanks to SAVE and your representation at the event, at our event, and the materials that you provide, people know what to do when somebody is in crisis. And that's an important piece of why we do what we do, is to educate people on what steps to take. We didn't know what to do. Like we did know Tim was in crisis just a few weeks before he took his life, and we were at a loss.
Right.
And so, we really feel it's important to equip people with knowledge and resources.
Yeah, and that's a big piece again of what we're doing this week, right? Which is to have conversations about, how do you have a conversation with somebody who maybe in crises? How do you have a conversation with a friend, a loved one, a coworker, a neighbor, and ask them, are you thinking about suicide? And that's a tough conversation to have, right? That's a tough conversation to have with somebody who's your child. It's a tough conversation to have with somebody who's a friend or a coworker. But, in the same way that we teach people CPR to save a life from somebody who has had a heart attack or a stroke, we need to do the same kind of thing as we talk about suicide, which is kind of CPR for suicide prevention, if you will. Is you got to ask people those questions. You got to listen to them. And if they tell you they're thinking about taking their life, what do you do with that information, right? Is how do you get them access to resources? How do you support them so that it's just, my first experience with suicide was 45 years ago when my 16-year-old best friend died by suicide in a small little town in North Dakota. Not only did you not talk about it, the idea that his family would have had access to any kind of resources to help them with their grief and understanding, it was simply non-existent. And I cannot even imagine what that was like 45 years ago. And while 45 years later, things have certainly gotten, quote, better in the context of our understanding and our willingness to talk about it and support that's out there, the reality is that until you talk about it, you're willing to share these stories and share those journeys, it can feel awfully lonely out there.
So, in the 10 years we've been doing Run with the Herd, I think society has changed a lot. There is more willingness to talk about it. You see, mental health being a topic in workplaces, like it never was before. And to know that, maybe in just some small way, we were a part of helping with that change, feels really good, because it's different now than it was.
Yeah.
We're still a long way to go, as you know, but it's thanks to organizations like yours that, you've really made a lot of progress. And I think society's view has changed a lot.
Yeah. In the last couple of months, I've been to this past weekend was the Tom Poferl Memorial Golf Tournament. A couple of weeks prior to that was Natasha's Ride, which is a motorcycle ride up, a couple hours outside of the Twin Cities for Natasha Lukics, who died by suicide. And each of these events, Tom Poferl has been going on for 21 years, right? Yeah. Natasha's Rides now, I think this was the 6th year. And time again, when I talk to the friends and family members and those who are involved in putting these events together, that refrain about things are better now than they were when this first started, right? And that's really important. But what we also know is that things haven't gotten so much better that the numbers related to suicide are going on the decline in the way that we need them to. And so conversations like this are incredibly important. Your willingness to share the journey that you've both been on, both with Katie and with Tim, are incredibly important. As I said to you at the beginning of this 30 minutes was going to go like lightning fast, and we're almost done here. But before we end, one of the things that we're trying to do with each of these conversations as we end them is kind of end them with a hopeful message of some kind, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do, try to bring hope to people. And so as you think about this and you were to share a message of hope to other suicide loss survivors, what might that message be to them?
Well, for those that have experienced a loss, just know that it's not your fault that somebody decided to do this, right? And tomorrow will be a better day. I mean, better days will come for you, but finding a way, a mechanism to keep those memories of that person alive and to find ways to make a positive impact some way, somehow, is really, really helpful. I mean, it's been critical for us as a family to have these events as therapy, right? So there is hope, and I'll just leave it at that.
Well, of all the folks that I've had the opportunity to connect with, Bob and Lynn, I have continued to be amazed and impressed and in awe of all the things that you have done with Katie, with Tim, to help give back to others. When it's all said and done, none of us are in this alone. All of us have to be working together in this battle to save lives so we can ultimately win that war. And it's a privilege for us to be able to be alongside you when we continue to do that battle every single day here. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for sharing this. And thank you for sharing Katie and Tim with us as well.
Yeah. Thank you for what you do.
Yes, for sure.
Have a good day. Talk to you soon, folks.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.